Hey, welcome, David here. We have the Brundlecast on my channel today. A great honor to have John David Ebert and Michael Aaron Kamins here to discuss their new book on hypermodernity and the end of the world. The link to the Amazon is in the description. They've been making their rounds. They'll be on John France's, or at least John will be on John France's public space on Monday night. And so I'm excited to hear about the book. So I'll hand it over to John and Michael if they'd like to give any biographical information about themselves, and then we'll jump right into hypermodernity.
Michael, you want to go ahead?
Sure. And before we start, just to be clear, the book is actually written by John David Ebert and Brian Francis Culkin. I wrote the preface, and it's kind of a long preface, almost like an introduction and kind of literary piece in itself. So just want to give Brian credit. And him and John have been going on podcasts as well. So should I you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, my name is Michael Aaron Kamins, and I'm a poet and archetypal psychologist. My background is in the literary arts, but I also have training as a Jungian psychoanalyst, and I teach what is known as Ericksonian hypnosis, which is based on the work of Milton Erickson. So I'm interested in poetry, literature, and also archetypes, the metaphorical nature of language and metaphors that are implicit in cultural discourse, and particularly in tracking how metaphors, which exist in everything in our entire system of thought and communication, is based on what cognitive linguists call embodied cognitive metaphors. And that's how we structure our thought world, and our speech actually cues us to the metaphor systems that are operative in how we're thinking and structuring our world of experience. So as a poet, but also as a phenomenologist who's interested in archetypal images, I'm sort of looking at what are the metaphors, images that are implicit, not just in individual thought and communication, but also culture, and how those metaphor systems change and adapt over time, and how technology and media seems to have this feedback and feed forward relationship with these metaphor systems. Like, just a quick example, the way that we represent the human psyche to ourselves changes with the era. So at the time of Sigmund Freud, if you read Freud, the dominant metaphor in his work is that the psyche is kind of like a steam engine. And he's talking about how there are instinctual drives, and that there is libidinal energy that builds up like steam pressure that has to be released. With Carl Jung, the metaphor is modified slightly, and you get the idea that the human psyche is kind of like a battery, like an electric motor or dynamo that has negative and positive charges, and to keep the battery running, you have to have, there's this constant push and pull between the negative and positive valencies, like in a battery. And then in the 1950s, you get this idea that the human psyche and brain are like a computer. And so, and that's still one of the metaphor systems that we use today. And so there's this interesting relationship between metaphor and how we represent our own psyche and the environment that we're in. And before I continue further with that, just a little bit more background. Me and John have been pretty tight for, maybe about 8 years now, and I reached out to John because we have a similar background in myth studies, whereas John is more of a historian in his thinking, and so he tended to lean more towards Joseph Campbell. I tended to lean more towards Carl Jung, just because I'm more interested in psychology, but we have this similar background in studying world mythology and the esoteric traditions of the West, and so I reached out to him at a time in my life where I felt like I had sort of dried up as a poet, and I sort of exhausted what I felt, all the different forms that I had tried. I had kind of gone through the whole canon of poetic forms and got to a point where I thought maybe poetry was just a phase that I had outgrown, and there was some sense of exhaustion and a sense that the way that I was approaching it had no vitality anymore, like the creative wellspring had dried up. But then I discovered John on YouTube, like so many of us have that have found John and that are part of this hypermodern circle that we're calling it. And one of the things that I learned from John was, after the correspondence for a little bit, as he was turning from myth studies, realizing that whole field itself had become exhausted because, with Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, that sort of became the only game in town. And with a few exceptions like William Irwin Thompson and some of and even John Ebert's his take on myth, there was nothing really original going on with it. So John turned towards thinkers like Heidegger. He went through this examination of philosophy, of modern, postmodern, and contemporary philosophy, and started putting up videos on Heidegger and Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari. And so when I discovered those videos, it really lit something up for me. And one of the things that John was talking about, which is something he talks about in his book Art After Metaphysics in great detail, is this idea that the structures that held the collective unconscious and the archetypal images and properly ordered them, sort of like the like as a metaphor, like the zodiac and the sort of cosmos of Aristotle, where everything is perfectly ordered. The archetypes are perfectly ordered and structured, and they're able to give meaning to life. John recognized that whole thing had been withdrawn, and so there was this, what he calls the rubbish heap, which is this sort of T.S. Eliot's idea of a heap of broken images that we are left with now in post-modernity, and that what I realized that what I was going through as a poet was not a personal thing. It wasn't that I was exhausted. It was a collective thing, to use the way that Carl Jung might describe it, or a transpersonal thing. And it was that poetry had to be reinvented. And what I was doing was something along the lines of surrealism, which was based on this idea that the poet can go within and find images inside, and the unconscious can be a source of inspiration. But by the contemporary era, even that has broken down in a sense, and the sort of interior place where there should be these images that can help give guidance to life and poetic inspiration is no longer working in the same way. And so when I was listening to John, so he turned me on to all these great thinkers, and and I started reading them, and people like Paul Virilio and Jean Baudrillard, and you can imagine coming from Jungian psychology and archetypes, and then suddenly reading Derrida and that stuff. There was a sort of internal war going on inside of me, and there was this interesting process of metabolizing what Rimbaud says. The poet Rimbaud says something like, "I'm committed to taking on all the cruel developments that the soul has undergone, in the last couple of hundred years." And I think that's from his poem "A Season in Hell," where he's talking about the difference between the sort of pre-modern magical mythical way of being in the world and this this flattened rational mentality that had come in with modernity. And Rimbaud was saying something along the lines of that for the poet has to be absolutely modern and has to, even though he might be connected and rooted in this ancient soil, the poet has to somehow discover what the locus of today is and connect with that. And so reading these books, reading these thinkers, kind of going down the rabbit hole with John, it lit up this new landscape, this new metaphor landscape, and which was also something that I saw in John's books. So John's books, for example, Dead Celebrities, Living Icons, all the way from that down to Art After Metaphysics, and in between that you have John's books like New Media Invasion, Age of Catastrophe, and everything John has done since. And I noticed that in John's work there's this metaphor landscape that, because when I read stuff I can see pictures in my mind of what I'm reading, and I realized that John was articulating this new landscape, and then that became something that I did an equivalent of in my book Absences, which was written at the same time John was working on Art After Metaphysics. So John would be working on a draft for a chapter of that book, and he would send it to me, and it would totally light me up, and I realized that what I was trying to do with poetry was the equivalent of what these contemporary artists were doing that John was talking about. And that landscape, that metaphor landscape, is what we call hypermodern. And we realize that it is truly a unique and new epoch, because in 1995, with the internet going public, it brought in a whole new set of metaphors. And one way you can tell if you're in a new epoch, and it's difficult to tell that because it's like McLuhan always talking about the fish never discovers the water it's swimming in, and that's the way media is, especially media that makes life more convenient. There's a relationship between convenience and invisibility. The more convenient it makes things, the more invisible the technology is, or the media is. And so in 1995, you have this new metaphor of the internet that comes in, and it totally transforms our mode of being in the world. It transforms our sense of ontology, epistemology. Even McLuhan talks about how technology changes our sense ratios. You know what I'm saying? So, for example, the Gutenberg press and print steps up the visual system, and whereas radio and electronic media retrieves this acoustical world that's more primitive, and which is to say that technology, media actually changes us psychologically, neuropsychologically. So there's that, but then there's also this whole new metaphor landscape that's come in since 1995 that we call hypermodern. And one last thing I want to say about that is that this group of hypermoderns, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek inside joke that we have, of just a way of talking about our friends. There's a line from the philosopher Timothy Morton, who wrote a book called Hyperobjects, and in that book, he's hyperobjects are these objects that are so massively distributed across time and space that they're not like, they can't be understood through perspectival 3D perception. They're four-dimensional objects, and really appreciate them, there has to be you have to sort of recognize that there's this dimension of time that's folded around them and that somehow catches you up into them. And so he says, Morton says that we're in the age of hyperobjects, and he's referring to this era that we're calling hypermodernity. And he says something really cool, which is that about this era, which is that something like we've woken up to discover that we are inside of an object, like a film about being buried alive. And that reminds me of the movie Kill Bill Part 2, where Uma Thurman's character gets shot by I think a tranquilizer dart or something like that, and then she wakes up in this, in a coffin or in a box, and she's being buried, and it's it's a horrific image, but it reminds me of kind of what the hypermoderns are doing, in the sense that we've woken up to discover that we are inside of an object, a hyper object, and that object is the internet. And it's really important, before it becomes more and more invisible, and we become more immured and embedded in it, for us to notice it now and start to articulate these implicit metaphors, whether that's paint, like Mary Church, the artist, the American artist, or Chris Boyd, the UK digital artist, or me with my poetry, or John and Brian with their books, and it's important for us to start to articulate these metaphors, and for other people to start doing it, so we could orient ourselves to this really strange, this integral hyper reality that is hypermodernity. So I know that was a mouthful. With that, I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah, awesome. That was about 15 minutes there, but you're pretty complicated, and you're spanning multi-generations of history and a whole bunch of ideas. So I thought it was good to just let you say the whole your whole piece. But thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, so I guess I should introduce myself. My name is John David Ebert, and I'm the author of 26 books of cultural criticism. So I've been doing this for 3 decades. And I started back right out of college in the mid-90s, working for the Joseph Campbell Foundation. It was Joseph Campbell and Oswald Spengler who turned me on to the world of cultural studies in the big picture sense. And I knew after I read them that I didn't want to continue any further in academia, because I knew they would try to crush that big picture out of me and get me to specialize. And I wasn't interested in specialization. But I did get hired by the Joseph Campbell Foundation to edit his footnotes for his posthumous books. And I did that job for about 5 years. And then they lost their contract with HarperCollins because those books weren't selling at all. And then after that, I decided I better get busy and do my own writing. And so I put out my first book at the age of 30 called Twilight of the Clockwork God, which was a series of interviews with people like Terence McKenna and Stanislav Grof and William Irwin Thompson, people of that nature, who had some kind of an interest in myth. And I was interested in seeing what the impact of myth was on their work. So I did that for a while, and then I sort of became disillusioned with, it was a little bit new agey, and I became disillusioned with that new age world and its anti-intellectualism, and started moving more and more into philosophy. And at first I started with German philosophy, Kant and Schelling and Hegel and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and those guys, and eventually Heidegger, but a Heidegger way later on, and moved from the German world, and then eventually discovered French postmodern philosophy, starting with Jean Baudrillard and Paul Virilio, and then I moved on to Deleuze and Guattari's masterpiece, A Thousand Plateaus, and then read all of Foucault and a bunch of Derrida. And so that's been the trajectory of my career, writing various different books on different topics of culture, such as The New Media Invasion in 2011, which was an examination of all this new media. At that point, I wasn't aware that we were actually shifting into hypermodernity. The term wasn't even, I wasn't even familiar with it at that point. And then I followed that book with The Age of Catastrophe, which was an examination of our ecological crisis. And then I moved on from that to write Art After Metaphysics, the book that Michael was talking about. And then a bunch of other stuff, you know, I wrote a book on graphic novels, a book on film, all kinds of different things. And so it's been, you know, it's been an interesting career. It hasn't been boring. So that's where we're at with me up to this book.
That's it, John.
What's that?
I thought you were going to go for 2 more minutes. Just kidding.
That's enough for now. Let's put it that way.
It says your microphone is muted.
Oh, David's is?
Oh, yeah, I apologize.
Okay.
Yeah, I try to mute myself in order to avoid feedback when the other people are talking, because else it picks up the background noise. Yeah, and I think John is a pretty popular streamer, and a lot of people are very familiar with him. I was mentioning to John before the stream started, I'm a big chess player, and I noticed that the school of hypermodernity in chess came after World War I with the concept of using the flanks as opposed to the center, where the best chess players in the world had developed these kind of like strict rules for what the best way to go about playing good chess was, and control the center and good piece placement. And then the hyper-modern school of chess referred to these like flank attacks, or the concept that you didn't necessarily need to control the direct center. So I don't know if there's any direct connection to the terminology in the chess world of hypermodernity to the hypermodernity in art.
How far back was this, David? When you first heard this term, how far back was it?
So if you just click on Wikipedia, it says it's after World War I, and there was a world champion or very top player named Reti, and there's the Reti opening, which like Fianchetto's the bishop, and he was able to defeat top world players using at the time an unorthodox school of these flank attacks. And so these flank attacks were termed hyper-modern.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Yeah, we did not invent this term, that's for sure. I had just heard it in the ether, and one day last year I decided to do a Google search on it and look up what is hypermodernity, and nowhere could I find, not on Wikipedia, not on any website, a clear definition of it. A lot of vague things, extremely vague. So I figured, well, I have a pretty clear idea of what it is. So I wrote that blog piece on hypermodernity last year, and it was very popular. And that piece became the introduction for this book. So that's sort of how this came about, how this book came about. It basically grew out of the seed of that blog piece.
I took a class in university for a requirement, Heidegger and Derrida, and I read through quite a bit of Husserl, Heidegger, and Derrida. It was very interesting, and also Freud. I went to like a special in Metro Detroit school that was created by a disciple of Freud, and was largely based on Freudian teachings, and that's all very interesting to me. And I also love history and looking at the long term of historical forces and how they play out. So obviously, I think your book is it's basically a conversation between you and Mr. Culkin, over this
Francis Culkin
topic. I watch you on a few different streams, so people in the audience, they're kind of thinking, The Matrix is a good example. You use in the book The Truman Show of like waking up and being in the internet, where all of a sudden we're part of the experiment, and there's no way around it. And a lot of people know this with like the red pilling example that's became very popular, where it's just like, okay, I realized I'm part of the Matrix, whether I like it or not. And I think you
the red pill, totally. That's right.
Yeah, you had mentioned on another stream that you kind of wanted to make it more imminent, to make it sound kind of more important than it usually is, because in terms like Heidegger and Derrida, deconstructionism and ontology is kind of a dry subject, and it's very hard to convince people why it's important, as where you are trying to connect it to more like art and pop culture, and maybe technology, to show people the imminence and importance of these ideas to people's everyday life.
Yes, that's correct. Yep. So I didn't understand the question, David. The question is what now?
Well, I guess I was just kind of rambling, but I was curious about the framing of your, if you're what new are you adding? Or are you just kind of explaining this concept of hypermodernity to a more general audience with more pop cultural or current news, as opposed to the general, more like dry philosophical explanations people get?
No, that's exactly right. It's aimed at the average educated reader. So it's aimed at a popular audience, not an academic one. And we deliberately avoided using too much jargon and terminology from the field of critical theory because we wanted it to reach a wider audience, because I think it's something that a lot of people don't know about. Number one, a lot of people hear the term hypermodernity and they still haven't heard of it. And they're like, what is that? What are you talking about? So it's still something that's new, even though I think we've been in it since 1995 when the NSF turned the internet over to the public. It's still a new term, and so what Brian and I wanted to do was to bring it up to the threshold of people's conscious awareness that, hey, we're in a new epoch here, that's structurally, morphologically distinct from previous epochs, from postmodernity and modernity, and the Enlightenment before that. Let's say each one has its own particular structure, and it's very clear that hypermodernity also has its own particular structure. It has, for instance, its own. On the technological plane, everything is digital. So whereas in postmodernity, everything was analog. So there's a technological shift. On the political plane, it's neoliberal politics. It's neoliberalism plugged into the matrix, basically, with electricity sent running around the planet. That starts in the mid-90s. Then on the personal subjective plane, you have the transformation of the subject into an avatar that is deworlded from all local horizons and sent beaming around the planet. Each one of us now has been deworlded by the internet and sent into circulation around the planet, like satellites in the exosphere. And so now we have these sort of narcissistic avatars that we interact with. And the other, it's a bit of a cause of concern, because I think, to use the Korean German philosopher's Byung-Chul Han's phrase, the expulsion of the other has taken place, whereby there is no real relationship with the other anymore. There's simply a relationship with the screen. And the screen is basically a mirror. It's an electronic mirror that simply mirrors yourself back to you. So there's a kind of, it encourages a kind of narcissism. So there's that. And the world interior of postmodernity was the shopping mall. Whereas in modernity, it was the arcades that Walter Benjamin talks about in his Arcades project. The world interior now is the internet itself. And you can tell when an age has passed by the time you get on the landscape rotting hulks of empty shells, like in the Rust Belt. You knew when that industry was dying in the 60s and 70s because it's all full of ghost towns now, like Gary, Indiana, and Buffalo, and Detroit. Same thing with shopping malls. They're just these empty shells now littering the landscape. So the world that animated that shopping mall world is gone. The soul, as it were, the animating soul of the shopping mall world simply has vanished and gone elsewhere into the world interior of the internet now. You do your shopping.
Here, and I've taken.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a whole shelf of books on urban planning, and like I read, you were mentioning like Jane Jacobs and Robert Mosen, but I want to ask a question from the chat. I've had this viewer, he calls himself Oswald Spengler, and he's asking about the connection between hypermodernism and metamodernism.
Well, I don't think it matters what you call it. You can call it ultra-modernity, meta-modernity. One guy calls it digimodernism. I don't think it matters what you call it. It's just that I think the term hypermodernity rolls off the tongue. It's easy to say, it sticks in your brain, and it's just a simple, convenient way to terminologically indicate what's going on. It doesn't matter what you call it.
A quick question from the chat, because a lot of these viewers view Luke Ford and are curious about your relationship with Kevin Michael Grace, and you say a lot of similar cultural critiques or trends similar to him. I'm not sure if you have what your relationship or commonalities with Kevin Michael Grace are.
I don't have a relationship. I'm not even sure I've heard the name before. What is it?
Ford's co-host, cultural critic from Canada, but that's fine.
Doesn't ring a bell.
Maybe I'll ask one more quick question and then pass it back to Michael about this concept, the new technical age, and kind of like the learn to code meme. where you could change your reality. I mentioned chess also, where now computers are better than humans at basically everything. Although to some respect we could work together with the computers for self-improvement and coding and just like streaming and all this different thing that's applicable to make our life better, but it's applicable on our relationship with the machine as opposed to our relationship with each other. And even maybe I can't get along that well with my fellow man, but I could manipulate my relationships with my fellow man through manipulating my relationship with the screen, with the machine.
And that was for Michael.
Well, either one of you. I mean, I'm not sure that I'm kind of put my own thoughts into your book and what you're talking about it with things I've been thinking about for a while.
Michael, any thoughts from you?
I like what you said about chess and how there's I guess one of the earlier uses of the term hypermodernity had to do with the game of chess. And I would look at that as another one of these conceptual metaphors and something about the structure of a game. And a game is a set of codes that have to be manipulated in a certain way. I'm actually really interested in the semiotics of video games, and I think that one of the insights into hypermodernity has been through when I was a kid I played video games, but in my adolescence I got into rock music and kind of put all that stuff away. But just recently I've started being interested in them again and looking at them, and I think that there's a lot of there's a lot that I think you can learn about whatever this hypermodernity thing is that we're trying to articulate through studying video games. And actually we have a tentative plan to do a book on video games and hypermodernity. But yeah, I guess I'm trying to find what
does learn to code mean? The popular learn to code, and now that we're interfacing with the screen, my relationship with both of you gentlemen or anyone watching this is through the screen, and the way to change our relationship is largely through our relationship with the machine, not our relationship with each other.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's these mediated relationships. It reminds me of there's a sort of post-Jungian psychoanalyst named Wolfgang Geigerich, who's out in Germany, who's written some really interesting things about technology, and he talks about medial modernity, and which I think has some resonance with our idea of hypermodernity. And he's basically talking about a kind of modernity where everything is mediated through codes, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
Was it something to get used to, kind of like the learn to code meme, where it's just like if you want to get ahead in the modern world, you have to learn to code? Or is it something you're warning people about that could have disastrous consequences?
Well, the consequences are, I think the consequences are disastrous. They're disastrous on human relationships. I think that, you get these companies like Facebook and Tinder, and they're looking to capitalize on things now that they've never capitalized on before, like friendship and love. How can we make money off of friendship? How can we make money off of love? And I think that Facebook would never have come into being in the first place unless there had been a disintegration of community that already is presupposed by it. Michel de Certeau, in his book, The Practice of Everyday Life, talks about this idea of phatic communication, P-H-A-T-I-C. Phatic communication is simply communication that's friendly. Like, hey, how you doing? It has no other purpose beyond that. And phatic communication flourishes in communities and neighborhoods which have not been torn apart yet, let's say by the automobile, a la Jane Jacobs. And you get people walking around interacting with each other. But as Jane Jacobs spent her career talking about, the automobile decentralized the city through urban sprawl, pulled it apart, pulled neighborhoods apart. And so individuals have become more and more and more isolated through technology. And I think Facebook was an attempt to solve that problem. It came into being simply as a way of connecting people who had been separated from each other spatially to reconnect them again somehow at the speed of light. So on the internet, as McLuhan would say, we're traveling at the speed of light. We're plugged in and we are living now at the speed of light, crashing into each other. But I think that it tends to, I mean, the friends that I have on Facebook are not people I know. 99% of them are people, I wouldn't call them friends in any real sense whatsoever. They're just simply, maybe they're fans of my work or acquaintances. So I think Facebook flattens out the concept of friendship. And I think these technologies have had more of an isolating effect on people than a communal effect, than bringing people together. I don't see people in communities brought together too much by these technologies. The people are too far apart to begin with. Unless you get something like Arjun Appadurai's diasporic public spheres, which he talks about in his work, where he talks about, people who are separated from distances can be brought together through the internet, like let's say a community of lawyers or a community of doctors. They're diasporic because they're so far away from each other. But maybe in that sense, it brings people together into these diasporic sphere communities. So I see it that way, perhaps. But
Michael's background in Jungian psychology, because Einstein's famous quote of mankind's ability to manipulate technology has rapidly outpaced our ability to get along with each other. So I mean, saying
that's right.
Conceivably that these technologies should be benefiting humanity, but it's largely psychological ills or Freud and civilization and discontent that means that the technology can't actually benefit us the way that it's capable of.
Yeah, and it has a numbing effect. As McLuhan used to say, I don't think the average soldier isn't going to pour gasoline on some kid's head and light it on fire. But if you put him in a jet plane and put him up in orbit, he'll gleefully drop the bombs because the technology has numbed him. It has distanced him from the effects of what happens on the human plane. I think this is true of drone pilots as well. There's an excellent movie directed by Andrew Niccol. I forgot what it was, and Ethan Hawke is the main actor in it, and he plays a drone player. And all he does is go into this garbage bin in Nevada somewhere and sits at a control panel with a joystick, dropping bombs on people in the Middle East. And he's like, how is this human? It isn't human. It's totally dehumanizing. Let's say you're walking down the street and you bump into someone. You say, "Oh, excuse me, sorry, I didn't mean to." But the same thing in an automobile now. If someone cuts you off in an automobile, you hurl invective and curses at them. They're a son of a bitch, because there again, the machine numbs the human relations. And so technologies do not make necessarily, they're not neutral at all. They have effects. They have disintegrative effects on human relations, and they have disintegrative effects on communities everywhere. So I just don't trust them.
Or are you proposing solutions, or are you just pointing out social ills and problems that the average person might not be able to connect the cause and effect? But do you actually see that maybe there's solution, maybe there is some way to harness the power of this technology for the benefit of mankind?
The solution has to lie in spirituality. For me, spirituality is about being authentically human on this planet. Human with each other and human with a relationship to the other side. And I think spirituality is extremely important here. And I'm not talking about religions in the sense of warfare. Most religions came into being for ethnic reasons, to identify a particular social group against that other social group. I'm talking about spirituality in the larger sense of being rooted in a dimension a recognition amongst multiple individuals that we're not just made up of atoms and molecules that are being knocked around like balls on a pool table. It's not that way. We are souls that have come from elsewhere, incarnate in bodies, and there needs to be a realization of that. And that kind of spirituality bonds people together, just as it does, for example, let's say in AA. In AA, they don't care what your idea of God is, as long as you have some belief in a higher power, and everyone there shares that belief in the same higher power, and it creates a bond. It pulls them together. And so the solution to the numbing effects and the destructive effects of technology has to lie somewhere in spirituality. For me, that's where the solution has to be found.
Did you want to comment on this, Michael?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's interesting. If you listen to some of the words John is using, he's, the metaphors of disintegration, which is, Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, wrote a book called Liquid Modernity, and he talks about how with postmodernity, he's using the metaphor of liquidity to represent that postmodernity is a melting down of all of the axioms of modernity. And those axioms are metaphysical, and they are a result of what Heidegger talks about as the metaphysical tradition or metaphysical age, which begins with the classical Greek philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle. But with postmodernity, you get the melting down of those axioms, for example, of the of individual value or the sovereign individual, free will, and the idea of God as well, which sort of anchors the whole modern horizon. And so you get this liquid modernity, you get this liquefaction of everything at that time. And one of the metaphor systems that I'm really interested in is alchemy, because I think that alchemical images and concepts are right in between where the alchemical imagination, which goes back through the Renaissance and then goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians, and then there's also Chinese alchemy, and the alchemical tradition is kind of where two worlds come apart and also come together for the last time, which was the world of medieval natural philosophy and then the world of modern progress and technology. And Carl Jung, for example, was really interested in alchemy because he saw that at one time, trying to understand the unconscious of the modern individual, trying to understand the unconscious of something like modern technology. Well, alchemy is, the unconscious of technology, let's say, or of techne, for the modern Western, or what Spengler calls Faustian civilization, is an alchemical unconscious. And so those alchemical metaphors, I think, are really useful in understanding where we are in what I think of as this meta-narrative that goes from a pre-modern time to modernity, post-modernity, and now hypermodernity. But just to tie back to what I was saying before, John is talking about a disintegration, which in the alchemical tradition is an operation called solutio, which means solution. And it's a water operation, and it has to do with the first, one of the initial stages of alchemy has to do with dissolving the material or the object that you're going to transmute eventually into the philosopher's stone. So usually it would be something like lead, for example, or some worthless material. And in order to lift it up the scale of values, which is what the alchemist was trying to do, and trying to do that exoterically in the terms of perhaps being able to forge or manufacture currency. But really, and Carl Jung pointed this out, but it's also something that some of the more philosophical alchemists, like Gerhard Dorn, were aware that what they were doing was an esoteric practice as well. It was a spiritual practice that involved revelation, and many of them were conscious of the fact that what they were doing, I'm talking about the European alchemists, particularly during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, were aware that what they were doing was somehow continuing, sort of dreaming the myth on that what Christianity had left unfinished. And the idea there is that the alchemists believed that whereas Christ saved the soul of man, it was the responsibility of the alchemist to save the soul of the world, or the anima mundi, which is the world soul, which they thought of as a feminine being, or the Gnostic Sophia, who was trapped in matter, and that through the alchemical work, the alchemist participated in the salvation, participated in the sort of Christianification, not just of the individual soul, but of the entire world through the alchemical project. So they imagined the alchemical work not just about producing wealth for themselves, but that was really a metaphor. For them, the alchemical work was a historical goal and project. And it's not a coincidence, for example, that Oswald Spengler calls our era, right, the era that where we develop this highly sophisticated technology and come out of the medieval, come out of the Dark Ages. He calls it Faustian, right? That it's, we're in a Faustian civilization. For example, in the alchemical worldview, there's this Aristotelian vision of the cosmos with the Earth is at the center, and then it's embedded in these concentric crystalline spheres. But then with Copernicus, the Earth gets launched out into space, and so the modern Faustian world is obsessed with this leap into infinite space or into the sky, and so which is a very different way of imagining the cosmos compared to, say, the ancient Greeks, for example, who lived in this cavern cosmos where everything was sort of domed, just like I explained about Aristotle's, spheres within spheres. And so the Faustian Copernican revolution is about this leap into infinite space. And so now I kind of meandered a bit there, but what I was getting at was that it's not a coincidence that Spengler called our civilization Faustian, and what our civilization has done has developed technology in a way that hasn't been done before. And because Faust, Goethe's Faust, particularly Faust Part 2, it's well known that, or maybe it's not well known, but it's Faust Part 2 is an alchemical allegory, meaning that, if you read alchemical texts, a lot of them aren't just full of pictures and poetic statements. Many alchemical treatises are actually like stories, like a narrative that's full of symbolic, that has all kinds of symbolic stuff packed into it. So, so Faust Part 2 is actually an alchemical allegory, and Goethe self-consciously incorporated the whole alchemical virtual imaginary, you could say, into Faust Part 2. Many of the things that Faust is trying to do there correspond to alchemical projects. For example, he's trying to bring back Helen of Troy. And in a way, that kind of parallels the idea of the alchemist trying to rescue the Gnostic Sophia, bring her up from out of the underworld. But anyway, so there's this connection between Faust, alchemy, and so it's almost like the unconscious, like I said before, of our technological civilization is this Faustian alchemical unconscious, And so that was a long way of saying that John is talking about a disintegration, which postmodernity comes around and does. It liquefies all of these axioms and structures of modernity. But I've noticed something kind of interesting. And one thing that happens in alchemy, and this could just be coming with the territory of being a poet, that I have a tendency to extend metaphors too far, maybe, or maybe take them too literally. But one thing that happens is that the next step after something dissolves and is liquefied, it has to dry out, right? It has to go through a process of sublimatio, or sublimation. And if you apply heat to the liquefied substance that you've created now in your alchemical hermetic vessel, then it will start to vaporize. And it's important to know that the alchemical operation of solutio, which is the water liquefaction operation, is a destructive operation or a deconstructive operation, because when you liquefy something, you're destroying its form and returning it back to the original chaos, which is imagined in many traditions as the ocean, as the sort of, in our own scientific narrative, it's the primordial soup. In the beginning of Genesis, God hovers over the abyssal waters. So the solutio operation is a deconstructive operation, and I think that that's what postmodernity was about this great solutio that was performed on this sort of hyper object of modernity. And so the next step, and I think that hypermodernity is about one way of thinking about hypermodernity is that it's about exploring the possibility that we're now going through some sort of sublimatio process, through some sort of vaporization. And when you sublimate something, you don't destroy it, you don't destroy its form, you sort of step it up into its Platonic ideal. So you sort of transmute the thing into archetype or Platonic ideal, into its spiritual. You sort of spiritualize it. It's kind of related to Hegel's concept of sublation. I think the word is Offenbung. Aufhebung, right? And so the alchemical idea of sublimatio is a sort of imagistic, sensory way of imagining this conceptual idea, Hegel's conceptual idea of sublation. And so what I'm saying is that it's possible that hypermodernity is this great drying out process where you can almost see our screens, which are everywhere, are almost like hermetic vessels, and we're sort of being vaporized, or at least our psychological mode of being in the world is being vaporized through digitalization and telepresence, and it's like a digital sublimate that's collecting at the top of the hermetic vessel, which, it's like our screens are like these vessels, and we're sort of are not literally, but our sort of psychological mode of being in the world is being digitalized, vaporized, and reconstituted in this web, or internet, which is a container, like a vessel. And one more thing about it is that this idea that I'm saying, it seems kind of far out, and I know that it's something that's open to interpretation. Like, I'm just telling you, I'm describing something that's just imagistic, and I don't know what all the valencies are yet, and I don't know enough yet to have a moral stance to this great sublimatio that's happening. The most that I can say about it is that it does seem to be, hypermodernity does seem to be part of this eschatological meta-narrative that the postmoderns thought that we had gotten out of that. They thought they had dissolved all that, but they actually just took us to the next stage in a sort of Hegelian dialectical turning. And so hypermodernity, if the project of metaphysics and modernity with the alchemical tradition in between has been about creating the philosopher's stone as a historical reality. And the philosopher's stone is something that makes all things possible, right? It's something that is hard to discover, and yet it's everywhere and it's free. It's something that can connect other beings together within the great chain of being. And it's something that provides all knowledge, you know, it's the stone of the wise. And it's also something that creates its own firmament, its own sky, which the philosopher's stone, there's a higher stage where if you sublimate the philosopher's stone, it becomes something called the sky blue kalim, which means
Hebrew for vessels.
Yeah, there's a couple
Kabbalistic.
different. There's a disambiguation that with that word, but the way that the alchemists used it was it meant it means sky. There's a constellation I think called Kalim, and it also means blue. So it's like the blue sky. And so what I'm getting at here is that you know, if we're ever talking about modernity, whether we like it or not, we're in a meta narrative, and so I'm just trying to track this meta narrative of Faustian civilization, and I see it having gone in a direction that is actually fulfilling the archetype of Faust, sort of literalizing it through contemporary hypermodern technology. And just one last thing about it, this is what I was trying to get at, was what I'm saying is it's actually phenomenological. Like I said, how with 1995 we have a whole new metaphor system that comes in that's based around the idea of the net and the web. Well, in about 2011, even though this has been around for a long time, like I think since like the 1950s, in 2011 you have the iCloud, which is the icon of the cloud that starts to appear. And it's not just one corporation, but it's like every corporation has this icon now, and it's everywhere you look. You know, everywhere you look around you, you see the cloud, an image of the cloud. It's what John would call an iconotype. And one thing, you know, John points out is that like the crucifix was the iconotype, or you know, Derrida's one of his transcendental signifieds, and the crucifix has been largely publicly erased from our civilization, which I think is very sad. And there's been this semiotic vacancy, or this absence, which is you know, the title of my poetry book, Absences, and explores this kind of thing. But I think that in 1995, why hypermodernity is a new age that's post-modernity is because that semiotic vacancies, all those holes and absences that came into being with the liquefaction that happened with post-modernity, those semiotic vacancies have been filled in by this net. So like there's this net that has covered up those holes, you know, for better or worse. That's too soon to tell what it means. And so there's that. And then the other thing is that, so I've noticed this cloud everywhere, and the cloud is an image of this alchemical sky blue kalim. It's an image of the ultimate alchemical dream, you know, alchemical Faustian achievement. You know, you see the cloud everywhere. It's almost like just even in the you know, the Judeo-Christian tradition of heaven as being the cloudy abode, or cloud nine, or Dante's Paradiso. And so we're like in the cloud. Everywhere we look, there's clouds, and it's sort of like, as a poet, you start to look at that kind of thing, and you start to say, well, what does it mean that that's this metaphor that surrounds us? You know, if you could think of it just apart from all of the corporate and techno-capitalist dimensions for a moment and just look at it, just what you're seeing phenomenologically, it's sort of like we're living in the sky blue Calum. It's like the internet is like the Philosopher's Stone. The way that I describe the Philosopher's Stone, its qualities map across to the way that you could describe the internet, which I didn't make that connection earlier when I meant to make that connection, but I didn't. So someone wants to rewind back and you can hear the small list of things that link the Philosopher's Stone to the internet. My point being is that it could be that we're living in the Philosopher's Stone, or that's the direction that things are going in, which is not necessarily something that is a human, something that has a concern for humanity. It sort of reminds me of an archetypal idea called dehumanization, which comes from archetypal psychology. And it's this idea that the soul sometimes has goals that are antithetical to humanism, and it presses on towards its own development and its own articulation, like the collective unconscious wants to manifest itself, and it's not so concerned with whether or not we like it, so to speak. And so, if we are indeed in this, if civilization has this morphological Spenglerian structure and also fate, it might just be that hypermodernity is the fate of Faust, and it's the destiny for the Western European soul to go through this sort of through this nightmare that John's talking about, through this technological nightmare.
Do you have your own YouTube page, Michael?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Do you have your own YouTube page?
I do have a YouTube page. There's not much on it. It's just some poetry and some stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, I enjoy it. Some of my chat is losing you because you're saying very complicated ideas, and they're I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you've been going at it for like 20 minutes there.
Yeah, sorry, but I'm going to stop now.
Yeah, no problem. It's also part of the technology. They make for nice, because you could record these soliloquies into your own YouTube, and then people want to learn more.
I apologize for that.
Yeah, no problem. Just people concentration levels, and you're saying complicated things going over hundreds of years of history. And if I could tie it back into what John said, and I also have a friend that says he knows John is a big fan, and if it's all right, I'm going to invite him on to ask John a few questions directly, but about Freemasonry and what John was talking about, spirituality being the possible saving effect. But unfortunately, there's so many multiple conflicting spiritual systems where you could add spirituality, but different spiritual systems conflict with each other, and so one person's spirituality could be in direct conflict with the next man's. And I'm not an initiated Freemason, but I love Freemasonic literature, and is the way to because Michael was talking about.
I should say though that Freemasonry isn't one of my areas of specialization, so it's not an area I've studied.
Yeah, I noticed you didn't include it in your book, and alchemy and Freemasonry is pretty connected, but just some sort of system, at least in the concept of Freemasonry, if not the Freemasonry that we see, that could be like the church, or it's corrupted, or may not be able to be saved, but some system to incorporate all these different technological, philosophical, spiritual systems into a working whole, where we will be able to harness the technology and all these different ideas in a way that isn't inevitably used for conflict. And if you don't mind, John, this man, he said he just messaged you on Facebook, but he's read a lot of your literature. He's a regularly appears on my show, and he was hoping to ask you a few questions directly.
Yeah, that's fine. Sure.
Okay, I'm just sending him the link. He goes by Gandalf. He was actually educated, I think, at Columbia, but due to the current, he's joining. I have a longtime viewer, as he calls himself Oswald Spengler, and he follows a lot of this.
Yeah, I've seen him around. Yeah, I've seen him. Familiar with the guy.
Yeah, he was asking you kind of about alt-right and your view of the modern alt-right use of Oswald Spengler versus your understanding of what Spengler really meant. And I haven't got around to reading. I got Tragedy and Hope from Quigley, and I've wanted to get to Spengler, but there's just so much literature out there that I haven't had the time yet to read Spengler. But I did watch your videos on it, and I encourage Michael to do, I mean, if you have time, to do what John does, to just put like little soliloquies onto a YouTube page, so that because to harness the advantage of the technology.
We're working on something that I've been trying to figure out how to. This is a good step in that direction, doing these podcasts. So thank you. Yeah,
I'm a tech guy, and that's why I said there's a certain element to the advantage now comes to the person who understands how to work together with the machine, and understanding and all these different ideas it could only be manifested through the ability to work together with the machine to program it.
It's like meta-programming,
Well, also, I mean, on a level, but I mean, you see a collapse of the machine, a collapse of the problems with all of Facebook and Google, and people here suffer censorship or promoting or shadow banning different ideas of versus just saying like, I got to learn to code. I have to learn. It could be like a dystopia. I know you guys put a lot of this together with pop culture and science fiction. But is there a way out of this dystopia, and is the only way out of the dystopia to basically, befriend the machine, so to say, and even to somewhat deify the machine, that the deity of the current industrial age is in fact the machine.
That reminds me a lot of something Robert Anton Wilson and John Lilly talk about with this idea. If I'm understanding what you mean by learn to code, I know the meme and I know the way that it's used, but I think that you're adding another valence to it that is really interesting, because it's sort of this idea of program. You have to program or you're going to be programmed, and it's kind of like this idea that I think Lilly talks about this, where it's one thing where you can program a computer, but when the computer can program itself, then it's reached another stage of evolution, and we're kind of there with ourselves now, because we have the ability to self-program or to meta-program. And so the person that is able to do that, and maybe this technology is one of the ways where we can do that, or at least program our reality. And maybe like you're saying, learn to code. Maybe that is maybe that's one of the ways through this is, program or be programmed. So. Yeah,
here in Metro Detroit, in fact, I would have been right now at the Detroit Institute of Arts for a chess program. We got the Diego Rivera murals, sponsored by Ford, where he basically deifies the industrial plants into these Aztec deities. And Gandalf,
right.
Before Gandalf chimes in, did you want to mention your thoughts on the modern use of Spengler?
Mention my thoughts on what now?
The modern rise in the alt-right and their understanding of Spengler versus your understanding, or
well, that's the alt-right likes Spengler because Spengler is very clear about each civilization having its own identity, and the alt-right is looking for an identity. They feel threatened in Europe anyway, the alt-right feels threatened by Islamic immigrants coming in with a totally different cultural sign regime. And cultures have sign regimes, and sign regimes are simply packets of signifiers that code. It's like a set of codes for a particular cultural way of life and a particular way of people relating to each other within that code symbol system. And Islam has a very different system of codes from the West, and Spengler is very clear about this, that each civilization has its own sign regime, its own set of codes. He calls them souls, but I like Deleuze and Guattari's phrase sign regime much better. And the West has been in a war with Islam forever. On the southern flank, Islam came up through North Africa and went up and crossed over into Spain and kept pushing up over the Pyrenees and was ready to conquer France, But in 732 AD, they were stopped by Charles Martel. That's called a boundary act. That's a term I've coined for what happens when one culture resists another from gobbling it up. The Greeks at Marathon against the Persians, that's another example of a boundary act. The Maccabean revolts against the Romans, that's another boundary act. So these are boundary acts. But in the West, so we have this boundary act with Charles Martel stopping Islam from gobbling up the West, and eventually they get pushed out all the way down to the time of Columbus, where they finally get pushed out completely. But on the eastern flank now of the West, Islam has been working its way west, gobbling up. First, it completely gobbled up the Ottoman Empire, just swallowed it whole like a piece of candy. By 1453 AD, the Ottoman Empire had lost its Greek identity and was thoroughly overcoated by an Islamic sign regime. But they didn't stop there. They kept going and going into the West, and by the middle of the 17th century, they were at the gates of Vienna. And so the Austro-Hungarian Empire came into being as a Western immune system to keep Islam out. So that was another boundary act on the eastern flank. So the West has been, and the West is geographically rather small, not counting America at this point, just, the Iberian Peninsula and Great Britain, it's relatively small. So it's vulnerable to conquest. And so there's been this war against Islam in the West, pushing it back and preventing it from getting in and gobbling it up, because Islam does that. The West does it too. We did it with, of course, the Aztecs. We swallowed that civilization whole also like a piece of candy. Civilizations do this unless they have very strong immune systems. And so I think the alt-right, at least in Europe, I know the alt-right in America is a little different, has different concerns, but at least in Europe is afraid that these Syrian refugees will bring in alien sign regimes that will begin to create, that will conflict with the Western sense of identity and what it means to be a Westerner.
Well, how about this as what it means? I'm a German. I've got ethnicity, 80% probably.
Is this Oswald Spengler? Is this the Oswald Spengler guy?
Yeah, I am. Well, I'm a big Spengler fan. Like,
okay,
he's not the guy in the chat who was asking.
No.
This is Gandalf, and he's a big fan of your work. And
this is Gandalf. Okay.
Oswald Spengler is someone who watches my content regularly and just uses that handle. But Gandalf is very well read. He's read quite a few of your books and watched a lot of your content.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, between Oswald Spengler, I mean, like if I had to have one author on a desert island to keep only his books for no one else, it would be Oswald Spengler.
Yeah, okay? Me too. I agree with you. That would be my choice as well.
Yeah. So I was thinking, I visited Bavaria in 2006. Only time I've ever been to like the homeland of 80% of my ancestors. Okay. I remember the beer I tasted there. Right, just drinking out of a stein at a bar in Munich, looking over the drawbridge. Right, it's a memory like that. It's now etched in. I lost all the pictures in a computer crash, unfortunately, from that trip. So it's now like it's consigned to my memory and my dreams. But I remember the beer I tasted there. Okay, and for me, right, Islam is somewhat hostile to alcohol. It's hostile to pork. It's hostile to a lot of the kind of culinary culture of Germans.
And this sign regime. Right.
And yeah, but food is so important to culture. I mean, agriculture, food, letting in lots of Muslims into an area with a unique food culture like that. And all the things Germans love most about what they eat are things Islam bans, frowns, or discards. I mean, this is like, one side's going to eat and the other side isn't if the numbers keep going this way. I mean, that's my concern. And I don't really like... I have a very, very strong aversion to violent conflict. Very, very strong. I hate people that promote it. I hate people that joke about it. So this is a serious issue, and I don't know. I'm not a big fan. I am not someone who's like, I'm considered, I guess, a soft ethno-nationalist. I don't think like, all people should only be the same ethnicity in an entire territory. No, we can let some people in and out, but it's got to be legal, highly controlled, and beneficial for the host society, and so that the people coming in benefit and the host population benefits.
Okay, Gandalf, you said you had questions for John, not to give all your political beliefs.
sorry, because I try to keep the conversation flowing.
Okay, yeah,
boundary acts. Boundary acts. What would be a boundary act between Europe and Islam in the 21st century?
Oh, well, boundary acts, I'm sorry to say, but boundary acts are always violent. That's just the nature of the game for a boundary act. So I'm not advocating violence, but I am saying the alt-right does have a legitimate concern about being gobbled up by Islam. It's not just some, oh, what are you worried about? There's a legitimate concern there. But yeah, boundary acts are always violent, as far as I know. I think the Aum Shinrikyo attacks in the subway tunnels in 1995 was a boundary act on the part of the Aum Shinrikyo cult, who did not want to participate in the modern version of Japan, which is basically an extension now of the West, with the complete industrialization of Japan. And there's no sense of real spirituality or a sense of that the individual matters. And for the Aum Shinrikyo cult, they created their own miniature religion, their own sort of microcosm, and their boundary act was the sarin nerve gas attack in Tokyo. It failed for them. It ended up disbanding the cult. And it was too big of a mega machine to stand up to at that point. A true boundary act, you got to have a tough culture going up against another tough culture. The Persians were tough. They were busy conquering the entire Middle East. The Greeks were tough. They weren't conquering anything much yet, but they were tough by nature. And when those two civilizations met, the Greeks were like, nah, you're not going to swallow us up. We have a certain way of life that we like. And so it has to be like almost like an equal match. The Aum Shinrikyo thing was just, it's just one minor cult.
What's the connection between boundary acts and fourth generation warfare?
What's fourth generation warfare?
Okay, you read William Lind on that, and I'll send you some links after this program is over. Okay.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have thoughts on that? Boundary acts and fourth gen warfare.
No, because I don't know anything about it, and I don't think Michael's probably never heard of it either.
No, I haven't heard about the fourth generational warfare. New idea.
Well, if it goes into I've had these debates with Gandalf and just say, if you have a violence is inevitable, a pro-conflict system, and maybe Islam or certain sects of Judaism or Christianity might have a pro-military, just saying it's the nature of man to rise up against man, of nation to rise up against nation, and that should just be expected from nature. Maybe Aristotle, form determines function, and the nature of the beast of man is actually violent versus more universalist.
It's the nature of civilizations and their immune systems. If they want to retain their sense of identity, who they are, a particular language that's spoken there, like Gandalf was saying, particular types of food. That's just the nature of the game when you're talking about civilizational immune systems. But that does not mean, however, that things are changing now on this planet. We have the internet now, which is taking signifiers from all of the different cultural traditions, putting them into orbit around the planet, and they're sort of forming rhizomes. They're hybridizing and they're coming together. And it may be the point that at some point the whole thing will undergo this, what Michael was talking about as a solutio, a dissolution in which signifiers cross and some kind of a planetary scale culture emerges out of all of this. So the question becomes then, are we all going to fall back into our little cultural boxes and insist that the cultural boxes that came into being during the second generation of civilization should remain? Or are we going to embrace this planetary idea that we're all on the same planet here and that the planet is actually shrinking due to technology? It's getting more and more claustrophobic with us. And are we going to evolve something maybe like a planetary scale religion that has a totally different sense of belonging and identity other than ethnicity? Like a religion of credo does. For instance, you can make a distinction between a religion of ethnicity, such as in India, where you have Hinduism and the caste system, or with Buddhism, you have a religion of credo, where that overrides the caste system, and all you have to do is say, I believe in what the Buddha says, and everyone is welcome. then it becomes a whole different type of system that can then be exported, as Buddhism was, to other cultures, and was able to go into China, go into Southeast Asia. That's a whole different thing. And the same thing with Christianity versus Judaism. Judaism is a religion of ethnicity, of descent by blood. Christianity is a religion of credo. All you do is say, I believe. And now we have a totally different idea of a belonging to a communal group, simply based on saying we all share the same ideology, not the same blood or the same ethnicity. Doesn't matter what area of the society you're from, this religion will unify it. And consequently, Christianity becoming a universal export to the West. So there are lots of variables here. It's not a simple, it's not a simple thing.
I really don't like Christianity. I was raised in the Catholic Church, and that screwed me up, okay? I mean, my thing is, can we keep ethnicity and credo? Is there a way to balance it? Like, in life, you need spaces where people of different types can meet and mix. That's kind of like the public space. But groups as kith and kin networks need places where they can keep people who want to do other cultural things out. How can we find that balance?
Depends on what you're, I mean, if you're saying that being a Westerner has something to do with being white, well, you're wrong. I mean, you're just wrong. And Spengler is very clear about this in The Decline of the West. The color of skin has nothing to do with it. Ethnicity has nothing to do with it. It has to do with cultural signifiers, that everyone in the West does Western things, goes to plays, you know, eats Western food, and you get a multiracial intermixture there. The West has never been ethnocentrically pure and purely white.
I agree with that.
Never been that case. So I don't know. You're asking a very complicated question here, but I think credo and ethnicity are. It's possible that they can be combined, but I think that I wouldn't identify culture as something that has to do necessarily with ethnicity, is what I think. It has to do with shared cultural beliefs and shared cultural practices by many different races. Let's take Mesopotamia, for instance. Mesopotamian civilization, this is the Sumerian civilization, was made up of two very distinct ethnicities, the Sumerians, who were neither Semitic nor Indo-Aryan. Nobody knows exactly what they were. They were just Sumerians. And the Akkadians. And the Akkadians were the proto-Semites. They were the earliest Semites. You have these two races, these two ethnicities, and they went back and forth. Sargon of Akkad was a conqueror. He was the first man, like Napoleon, to unify the entire civilization, and he brought in Akkadian signifiers. Then his empire lasted for about a century, and it was destroyed by the Gutian barbarians, and it collapsed. Then the Sumerian restoration began with the third dynasty of Ur, and they started collecting all of the what they thought were the originally authentic cultural signifiers of Sumer to build a revival under Ur-Nammu. Nonetheless, even though we have two completely different ethnicities, they both comprise Sumerian civilization, no matter which way you draw that on a map. That's Sumerian civilization, even though you have two warring ethnicities involved there. Civilization is never monoethnically pure, ever. It's just not.
Oh, I agree with you there, but I'm trying to, like, you know, I think in general, though, like, one of the problems in the West is it becomes more multicultural, and I'm open to keeping multiculturalism to some degree in the West. I mean, some cultures are just so radically different, it's really hard to combine sign regimes so that there can be political cooperation. I mean, for instance, we live in a country that, since the financial crisis, can't pass a budget. So we have to figure out some way to devolve power, and that's kind of what I'm thinking. Like, things are too centrally controlled, and as a result, the central power can't be legitimate enough to deal with all these multiple groups that are constantly proliferating that all need to have their interests fairly represented. So how do we handle that?
Well, I don't know. That's a tough question, so I'm going to pass on that. I just don't know what the answer is to that.
Well, maybe these are the questions we need to research and figure out, because these are the kinds of questions I'm interested in. I mean, right. one hypothesis, and maybe this would work. Maybe you can comment on this. Balancing Herbert Spencer and Henry Sidgwick of the 19th century with a very scientific let's categorize all the races, categorize all the biology, categorize all the Anglo-empiricists with the political theology of Spengler, and see if we can find a balance between the two that will allow us to maintain some multiculturalism in the West, evolve political power, and keep the peace.
Maybe so. I'm not familiar with Henry Sidgwick or the other guy you mentioned, Herbert Spencer. I'm not familiar with him, so I can't comment.
Yeah, I'm on a reading list with a friend of mine named Rosie P.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll send you stuff about that as we work on that on a Normie book in private.
Okay. Sounds good.
Do you have anything you want to add on this, Michael?
Oh no, I think John did a great job with all that. Yeah, I'm more into aesthetics and not.
I mean, because these very complicated concepts, you would like the long view of history and the accumulation of historical forces to what the current condition of, we'll call our present state of karma, that are based on the accumulation of a millennium of forces, and to see from a conflict nature that it's possible that these forces are just up against each other and conflict is the only way that's going to resolve it, or if there would be some sort of paradigm shift or new ideas, something that will make it possible that these opposing forces that have accumulated so much inertia can be stopped from colliding with each other.
Yeah, well, Muhammad figured out how to do that by uniting all the warring Arabic tribes. None of the tribes could get along. All they were doing was fighting, and he united them all together with a single idea: everyone should bow to one God, and put away your local polytheistic gods. Forget about those, and everyone is on the same page with a single monotheistic religion based on all different tribes bowing to the same God. So it could be something like that. On a planetary scale is what I'm imagining here, the possibility that all the different warring ethnicities and factions could come onto the same page if someone came up with a religious idea that could pull us all together as a single group on this planet. We're all human beings, after all.
And then they add into the environment also, because unfortunately, even if all humankind could come together, we have to come together with the Earth in a way that we don't damage the environment.
What do you guys think of the 19? Oh, sorry.
I'm trying to. That I think we're exploring is that because we're talking about how with hypermodernity, there's a new world that comes into being that's after postmodernity, which has to do with the internet coming into being. Now, whether or not John sees the marriage of the human nervous system with this kind of technology as a nightmare, and in many ways it is. But the fact is that I don't think we understand what the internet means yet and what its implications are yet. This hypermodernity thing that we're talking about, it's really the first time that it's enough of it has gone into the rear view mirror now that we can actually designate an epoch that has been constituted by the internet. And but all the things that you guys are talking about, right? Going back to my thing about metaphors, you guys are talking about bringing people together and connections and all that kind of stuff. Well, I mean, that's what the internet does, right? That's what that's what it is. It's a net that captures everything, and it kind of reminds me of this Christian idea that Christ is going to make his disciples fishers of men, and there's this idea that liquid modernity, postmodernity, melts down all the axioms of the modern world into this chaotic ocean, and then the internet comes and it's like this gigantic fisherman's net. Like this fisherman throws the net into the ocean of liquid modernity, and now it's sort of captured us, and we're sort of waking up to the fact that we're in this hyper object that is the internet. And I don't think we have any idea what the hell it means and what these kinds of connections mean. But it's strange how at a certain level, there's a certain sublation happening here where you guys are talking, like John is talking about a literal religion in referring to Muhammad that unites people, but in the way of a kind of Hegelian sublation, it's almost like, well, the internet does that as well, and it's become part of not just the technical infrastructure of our lives, but I mean, our lives are technical as well. It's become the infrastructure of our lives, and that's where we are right now. I mean, where are we right now? We're online having this conversation, and it's just going to become more and more vivid. It's going to become to the point.
Well,
I don't like technocracy, techno-fascism, technocracy. All that stuff to me is a nightmare as well.
I agree.
What's going on? And the fact is that you're eventually probably going to have something like goggles that you wear or contact lenses, and that the internet's going to be there, and it's going to be a surrounding space, and there's going to be a new reality. It's what Virilio calls reality substitution, and it's Virilio has this idea that where he talks about this as sort of a little bit of a disagreement with Jean Baudrillard's idea of the simulation and simulacrum, where Virilio is saying something that it's not that one reality simulates another one, because that implies that there was ever a real to begin with. But Virilio says no. What happens is that it's substitution is the idea, not simulation, and it's that one reality substitutes another one. So you have reality number one is replaced by reality number two, reality number three, and so on. And we're going through this process right now since 1995 of reality substitution. A new reality is coming into being. And of course, I mean, it's a total chaotic nightmare. But we have to be vigilant, and we have to keep our eyes open to the metaphor landscape, the metaphors inside of it and how they relate to this bigger picture of history, to the destiny of the West as articulated by Spengler, for example, the connections between Faust and alchemy and also the internet. And there's just, I don't know what it all means, but it's strange how the criteria that John was outlining just now, the criteria of that planetary, some kind of a planetary religion, and I'm not endorsing that idea or not endorsing it, I just don't know. But the criteria that John was just outlining is actually met by the internet. So I don't know what that means. I don't know. There's a new reality that's.
But it is now, though, the technology of the internet has now made that a possibility. It's not. I'm not saying it's something that's inevitable or will happen, but it is a possibility since the internet has eliminated all local horizons, in the sense that everyone can talk to everyone anywhere on the planet. So there's nowhere where you can escape into a little pocket and not be related to people. That is, if you're using the internet. Whereas all these religions have come into being because they were locally isolated. India was isolated by the Himalayas, so it had its little pocket world. China was isolated by being on the east there. The West was isolated. Every single one of these worlds came into being with their own unique religious identities precisely because they were isolated. But the internet removes isolation. That's what it does by its very nature. It deworlds civilizations, it deworlds individuals, and it puts them all into orbit so that we're all now crashing into each other.
But we're also all crashing into each other in private spaces because we're just at home doing this. I mean, there's a yin and yang to this. I mean, I think the one problem with your explanation, John, just a little bit, is there's always a light and shadow. I mean, I know you're very Jungian. There's another side to it. But anyway, I'm going to get to another question because I've been listening, the Fisher nets of men thing. I'm thinking, well, the trawler is getting up the Pacific garbage patch of plastic. That's how I look at what the internet is dragging up right now. And my second question is, I want a hierarchy. Nature and naturalistic religion, maybe some supernatural elements, I don't know, but nature and natural law at the top, man under natural law, and technology serving man. How can we get that? I think we have to get that hierarchy right. And that's kind of like my own kind of internal mental model. I mean, like
I don't know that that's necessary. I don't know that that's necessary. Yes, nature is hierarchical. Yes, it is naturally hierarchical. But I don't know that a religion, a planetary scale religion, necessarily has to have that hierarchy, because they all have different ideas. All the different religions have totally different visions. India has the caste system. The Japanese world is very mono-ethnic, and they want to keep it that way. And they're racially hostile to the Ainu, who are Caucasian, actually. Every case is different, so I'm not sure that it just has to be that way. The way that you're outlining this hierarchy. I don't think we can predict what some prophet is going to come up with as far as a religion. I mean, like we were saying before, an ethnic religion is going to be way more hierarchical socially than a religion of credo, which welcomes all comers. So those are two different ideas.
Just real quick before you say, Michael, you say it's kind of like the coding. Once you wake up and you realize you're in this hyper modern world, can you make it into your own, like choose your own adventure based on our ability, so to say, to code and adapt to the machine? And it's extremely unlikely that there's going to be some rules or some sort of code that's going to be enforced on humanity. It'd have to be someone who comes up with a paradigm shift and creates a better way of life that people out of their own free will and volition choose to accept. And and me and Gandalf have had on other streams debates about free will, where I guess he's skeptical of free will, but I'm a believer in pretty high levels of free will, where people in essence will be able to choose their own adventure, and you have their own volition in how they go about this, and you're not going to be able to have any imposed structure on people other than just the struggle to survive. I mean, do you have anything of that, Michael?
No, I'm just, I think I was asking before was if Gandalf meant, if he was talking about a hierarchy of values, not necessarily a social.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nature at the top, or some naturalistic religion which protects nature. Because, my other question. How many of you have you ever seen the Limits to Growth that was published because Kissinger and Rockefeller and the Club of Rome all put it together?
Yeah.
We're basically running their worst case scenario right now, which basically says in the 2020s, the whole world system implodes because just the physical forces. I mean, they can print as much money as they want. They can try and, fight as many wars as they want. Well, that could end up, if any nuclear weapons get exchanged, I mean, there goes the planet.
Never underestimate the possibility of human ingenuity, though.
Yeah, we got a question from the chat related to
go ahead.
Butterfly Flew Away about how John views demographics and whether demographics are a future threat to civilization, or you're taking a more theological approach to demographics.
Well, what is that? That's kind of a vague question. I mean, what is this person getting at specifically?
They're probably looking more like race realism and alt-right type politics as technological, all these different.
Yeah, I'm not interested in that as far as racism and white nationalism goes. It's not
what
my,
else the free?
not my field.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, certainly on YouTube, you get I can't get a single show going without the majority of the questions in my chat related to the topic. And I mean, it seems related to, people have to adapt to survive. And if these forces have to be a global order, there's going to be multiple factors that make it difficult for people to be able to adapt on a technological level, on a spiritual level, on a natural level, on an identitarian level. And, just taking the approach that kind of, it's going to be a conflict type nature where people have to struggle to adapt to the changing world, or can you have a social safety net in across all these various venues for people who seem to be failing to adapt to the quickly changing world?
That's an extremely, there's a lot in that question. I'm not even sure what the question is specifically. Because my point about Islam had to do with cultural issues, not racial or ethnic issues. It has to do with culture, not white nationalism or Europe being invaded by non-white peoples. Europe has had non-white peoples forever. You know, I don't think that, you know, that's not the issue. The issue is culture, not race. And you'll find this in Spengler. Spengler's very clear that when in his chapter, People, Races, and Tongues, when he talks about this idea that race is irrelevant in a civilization comes into being because of the people who have been in a certain area for a very, very long time. And those people, no matter how multi-ethnic it is, put together a civilization that everyone agrees on. That's all that matters. But if we're talking about, you know, the fear that the West may be engulfed by Islam, well, you know, I think there's a legitimate fear to that. I sympathize with the alt-right on that aspect, but not on the white nationalism. That doesn't interest me at all. But the cultural
let me comment, because I get in a lot of fights and I get weary based on this. Like, I just can't keep up anymore, because every time I go on alt-right streams, and I get called N-R-K-I-K-E. I'm just so worn out. I just want to get this out now. But at the same time, I will say this. I am a very, very soft ethno-nationalist, meaning I want people to be able to keep their heritage and identities, but boundary conditions were new. I guess maybe genetic flows maybe could be let in a controlled fashion. I think we can do a lot more on genetics than we think, and I don't want, you know, neo-Nazi Spurg LARPers, you know, controlling that conversation or framing it. And we have to somehow police that and deal with these questions with extreme nuance and subtlety and a lot of care. And it's a tremendous project that is going to require lots of very sane, very sober, very moral, very, you know, that type of people to do it. That's all I'm saying. I mean, I don't completely agree with Spengler on race. I mean, I've got a friend who does a lot of genetics who is not white, by the way, who messages me all the time, and I'm thinking, oh God, we're gonna have to relook at a lot of these questions. Okay, so that's all I've got to say on that. I don't like the Nazi Spurg LARPers and the extreme white nationalists either, though. I'll agree with you at least on that point. But I think Spengler was wrong, or at least incomplete on certain race questions. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah. So what about the larger social safety net? If all these various issues come in, is there a way to, you know, and there could be countless different things that cause people to not be advancing in the current hyper-modern world. Is it just going to be some sort of social Darwinism, or is there a way to have a larger social safety net for the people who can't seem to adapt?
What do we mean by advancing here, though? People who aren't advancing, what does that mean?
Here's an example. What do we do with UBI? What do you think about Andrew Yang's proposal? Maybe that could be a good example. That ties in with David's question, I think.
Yeah, I haven't been following Andrew Yang, so I don't know.
Well, here's what his plan is. He wants to give every American citizen, and he wants to amnesty a bunch of immigrants, which is causing his campaign, I think, problems in some areas. But he wants to give every American citizen 18 and over for life an opt-in to $1,000 a month.
I've heard that. Yeah.
He wants to pay for it. He wants to pay for it with a VAT tax, although he was on Tucker Carlson maybe a couple weeks ago, and Tucker Carlson has had him on 3 or 4 times, and Tucker Carlson wants a billionaire tax and a tax on Amazon and companies like that to be added to VAT. And that's kind of, I think, where it's going. Tucker Carlson, by the way, is not, because he's on Fox and everyone's pro-capitalism there and all that stuff, is not revealing his position, but I think he's friendly to UBI.
Yeah, we don't have to get too political. Let's keep this more.
Well, UBI. Talk about UBI. That could be the solution.
Yeah, I mean, we can't. I brought them on to talk about their book, and okay, I appreciate.
We're pretty far away from the book here.
Yeah, I want to.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll stop.
You could reach out to Mr. Ebert and try to schedule your own stream. So thanks for coming on, Gandalf.
Okay, I'll leave. I got to go anyway in 10 minutes. So take it easy. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Okay, yeah, he's a regular viewer, and
I know who he is personally. Actually, I recognize his voice.
Okay, yeah, he seemed.
Yeah, he's been a follower of my work for quite a while.
Yeah,
we've actually had a number of these conversations over Skype, so I know who he is.
So, was there anything else you wanted to cover, or any other areas you wanted to talk about? You know, unfortunately, there's so many different directions, and you're talking about, you know, as I said, it sounded like you're taking these important philosophical concepts that are generally not considered in the public view, and trying to put them in a way that's more popular to pop culture, or to show people the imminence or the importance of why they should be thinking about this greater philosophical ideas. And maybe
I should point out that it sounds like the book is vague, but it absolutely is not. The book is about the effects of the internet on human life. That's its main thesis. That's what it's trying to study. What is the internet doing to us as human beings? And so that's what the book is about. And it doesn't really raise solutions to the problem so much as simply go into a very thorough analysis about what the symptoms of the illness, let's say, are. You diagnose the patient first, then you prescribe. And this book is not prescriptive, it's diagnostic. And so we're diagnosing the situation of the effects of the internet on human life.
And you leave it open to people, because obviously people are using the same venue of the internet to try to come up with solutions, and a lot of people
absolutely
have solutions that they're trying to use. For example, the alt-right or ethno-nationalists or any different variety of people that have came onto this technology and think they have a solution to the world's ill, and are trying to use the technology to
like Michael said, we don't fully understand what this thing is and what it's doing to us. And Brian and I sat down to try to we had a series of conversations to try to analyze at least what the effects of all these things are on our lives as human beings on this planet. So we're still in a process of trying to understand what this new hyper object that we find ourselves inside, as Michael put it, is doing to us. So it's an investigation, and it's meant to raise questions. And that's the primary purpose of the book.
So you think race is too toxic, or what's the effects of people in the chat keep on wanting me to ask you kind of about these racial demographic questions, and I'm not sure if you have a direction how that fits into hypermodernity, or if you just think it's not an issue you want to discuss now.
It's a different issue, not related to this book, so we could discuss it another time, but it's not in this book.
What I have a friend here calls himself Forex Shark, and he's profiting. I was a day trader for a while. Thank God I was able to profit quite a bit from internet technology and stock trading, and I've streamed on Forex trading and different day trading techniques, and the different venue of hypermodernity and Bitcoin and all these various applications.
So what was the question?
Well, you didn't seem to cover it in your book, but it seems a pretty relevant venue of. I was just mentioning my background in day trading, but like Bitcoin and all these.
Sure, Bitcoin, yeah.
Financial applications.
This book is the first in a trilogy, so we've got 2 more volumes coming that will cover other aspects of hypermodernity, and we may indeed address Bitcoin. So that's a possibility, and these kinds of new currencies. Brian Culkin in particular is very good with economics. He understands them very well. So yeah, that's a good idea for us to factor that into the second book.
So are you more optimistic, or you say it doesn't matter whether you're optimistic or pessimistic? You're more diagnosing the current situation regardless of how the future is going to play?
I'm an optimistic pessimist. I think I would put it that way. I think that we've done so much damage to the planet that we're on a sinking. We're on the Titanic. It's going to sink. There's no question about that. The sea levels will rise and flood and sink all of our coastal cities in 3 to 5 centuries. But we'll be feeling the effects of it. Within this century, we're going to start seeing airports 3 feet underwater, and that's disastrous. Just a mere 3 feet sea level rise is totally disastrous to an airport. Forget about it. But on the other hand, human beings are amazing creatures. We come up with incredible things. I mean, we've been to the moon. We've created amazing religions with incredible religious visions. Who knows what possibilities this hyper-modern world is going to open up to us. I'm kind of excited about it. I'm a little nervous, but I'm also kind of excited because I think something new may come out of this that's totally unprecedented, a singularity, something we've never seen on this planet before. So I'm a mixture of both.
John Harris in the chat, and he's on a lot of these streams, if you heard of him, is asking about artificial intelligence. Is that part of hypermodernity, or does possible artificial intelligence open the level to a new stage in history?
It's definitely part of hypermodernity. Artificial intelligence is a big issue, and it's only going to expand and grow. I find it quite ominous. I'm not a fan of it. I've seen over my lifetime, I'm 51 now, and over my lifetime, I've seen more and more things get automated. You can't call any public utility anymore and talk to an actual person. You have to punch numbers and listen to a robot. And that's the most frustrating thing, because half the time they can't understand what question you're asking them. It's a fucking machine you're talking to, not a person. It can't understand ambiguities. So the nature of artificial intelligence, and the reason why I don't think it can ever mimic human intelligence, is because there are all these other areas in the psyche that can't be reduplicated by a machine. Machines are binary. They understand things in terms of yes, no. That's it. They don't understand gray areas, ambiguities, subtleties, irony, nuance. You're never going to get a machine that can pick up on those kinds of subtleties of the human mind. You might get a machine that can be an exteriorization of the calculative function of the human intellect, that can calculate things and can calculate probabilities and can do statistics and quickly apply them to a situation. But you're never going to get a machine that can understand a work of art. You're never going to get a machine that can stand in front of Picasso's La Demoiselle d'Avignon and appreciate it. That's not going to happen. That's not the way it works. And so I find it very ominous and uncomfortable and threatening, and it is a huge problem in hypermodernity, and it's only going to get bigger with people like Elon Musk, and Ray Kurzweil, and these techno-utopians who think that technology is the thing that's going to save us, that it's the salvific force. And I don't think that's the case at all, because these people are not people who have studied Marshall McLuhan or Jane Jacobs or Lewis Mumford, people who spent their careers studying the damaging effects of technology on human culture, on human social relations. These guys are totally naive about that. They don't come out of a background in the humanities. They come out with engineering degrees. So they haven't studied art and literature and poetry. Those worlds are totally alien to them. So I don't have a lot of faith in their visions.
Are you and Michael impersonists? I mean, I know you're both spiritual in taking an approach to spiritual forces in nature, but do you accept or believe in a personal God that, so to say, listens to prayer and interacts with creation on an individual level?
Yes, absolutely. I think Michael does too, isn't it?
Yeah, not to pull a Carl Jung, but I don't really like the word belief, because that, because that seems like that I don't think it's a question of having to believe in it. I think it's a question of knowing it and experiencing it in your own life. So I never really liked that question, just because it seems like it's sort of like asking, like, do you believe that this event happened or didn't happen, or like you're on trial? And I don't think that's the right way to think about God, or whatever that is, whatever that sort of personal intelligence is that is somehow involved in our existence. But yeah, me and John are actually very spiritual, very much into the esoteric traditions. Rudolf Steiner, the German mystic philosophers, is someone that we like a lot. And so, yeah, I would say that's a big part of my life as well.
My understanding of God is that, from my investigations into the afterlife and the other side, is that God is love. God is simply the primordial motive force, which is pure love, that has brought all of this into being. And all of us, all of our souls have emanated like sparks from a fire from this God being as individual entities. Leibniz had this wonderful treatise called the Monadology, where he talks about monads being all these little tiny souls, and God is the giant monad. And so, but the primary thing is that I see God as pure love emanating through and in all of us and through everything. And that's what I hear from near-death experience reports. When I listen to those and I hear the people talk about what they experience on the other side, they go to the other side and they just experience pure unconditional love emanating from this force that is all around. And so in a certain sense, Spinoza, I think, had this right when he said that God is time and space. God is everything. God is in everything. And so I don't see God as this single entity that's floating somewhere, neither male nor female, but as something that is much more powerful and mysterious and difficult to understand than that. It's something that perfuses and pervades all of us and everything that's alive with love. And I think love is the motive force of the universe. I don't think there's anything stronger. I think it's stronger than gravity or electromagnetism, and older. And the older a force is, the stronger it is, simply because it's been there longer. And love was there first before anything ever came into being. So it's the strongest thing that there is, and it can overcome anything.
Well, I agree, but if that implies, and I'm a big fan of Leibniz, I've read his work, and the concept of calculus originally being a spiritual science is something I'd strongly agree with. But if this concept of love is what you're saying, if it comes to personal prayer, and okay, let's say you've correctly diagnosed the problems facing humanity and the problems that we're all facing that could cause mass destruction, and you're writing about it, you're talking about it. But is there a power of, so to say, love or care for humanity, or even personal prayer that could affect the trajectory that we're going on?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I would say yes. They've actually done some interesting experiments with parapsychology and the internet, and they've found something like networks, with a bunch of people online, actually increases, parapsychological phenomena like precognition and stuff like that. And so
I'm a big Hameroff fan, like Stuart Hameroff in his Science of Consciousness conference that just was in Switzerland a few weeks ago. I have a lot of books. I stream on that topic regularly. In fact, John's going to be on JF's The Public Space, and I had actually debated him a few weeks ago about consciousness, and my streaming partner, Church of Entropy, she calls herself, debated JF about panpsychism. And I'm a believer in kind of panpsychism and these concepts connecting to even the physical reality. And it sounds like you guys are more part of these mystical panpsychic schools.
Yeah, I would say so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
But where does it? I mean, you're going to appear on JF, and is that just to promote your ideas? And presumably, he vehemently disagrees. He's an evolutionist and would reject any of this and have more nihilist views. But you're going to have discourse with them. And I watched your show when you were on them earlier, like a year ago.
We're just going on to promote the book. I mean, we'll get into any discussion he wants. That's all we're interested in. We just want to promote the book. I'm aware of Gary Eppy's views, and I'm aware that he was reluctant to have me back on because of my spiritualism. But Brian isn't that way. Brian Culkin is also very spiritual as well. But Brian, unlike Michael and I, is very concrete and pragmatic. He's good with economics and politics, and that will appeal to Gary Eppy. He will appreciate that. So the two of us will be going on there.
Okay, yeah, I'm a tech guy, so unfortunately, Michael, you're when people watch this back, probably the volume from me and John is going to be louder than your volume, and there might be tiny feedback issues. I didn't want to bother during the stream to the kind of some like, I guess, technical etiquette where people mute themselves or even walk through what the best technology or microphones or different things that are about streaming.
I have this on my phone because my couldn't get Google, could not figure out how to get the Google Hangouts to work on my Mac. So I'm talking to my phone on. So
I understood everything you're saying. People can, but I mean, people when they watch this back, there's going to be a volume thing where your volume is lower than me and John's volume. And so either they got to keep on turning up and down the volume, or it just comes. And I apologize about that. I'm glad I got you both on the stream. I appreciate your ideas. I appreciate your literature, and hope, you're look forward to volume 2 and 3. Was there anything else you wanted to discuss?
No, just mention that the book is available on Amazon right now for people to order.
It's linked in the description. So is
Great. Yeah.
Your Twitter. I guess I'll add your YouTube, and Michael, you have a lot of interesting ideas. I'd encourage you to make a YouTube account, because you're saying ideas that are.
I have some poetry on it. If anybody's interested in some of my spoken word stuff, they could find it on there. I also have a book of poetry that's on Amazon. John wrote the afterword for it. It's called Absences. And like I was talking about earlier, this idea of hypermodernity came out of this recognition that there's this new metaphor landscape that we're in. And so I encourage people to pick up Absences and get a sense of what that sounds like as poetry. And John did an incredible afterword for it. And I'm also about to put out a follow-up book to Absences called Clouds, which should be out in about 2 weeks, which explores the idea of the hypercloud, of being this cloud computing culture now, and the stuff that I was talking about, alchemy earlier, about the sublimatio, the air operation, and how hypermodernity is more properly an age that's moving towards vaporization, moving towards digital telematicization, coming out of liquid modernity and moving into the air, into the infinite space of Spengler's Faust, and of the cloud that we see around us. So my poetry book will be exploring that, as well as a bunch of writings on hypermodernity. I'm also on Medium, and I also am on Twitter, not as active on the latter, but yeah. So Michael Aaron Kamins, you guys will find me. So thanks.
Yeah, I'll try to link all that in the description. I actually did a senior research project at University of Michigan on data centers, and it was interesting to me because previously I studied in Jerusalem, a lot of Kabbalistic or spiritual stuff, and to see the modern technology is almost, in my view, is a physical manifestation of what a lot of the ancients and mystics talked about. And you mentioned that at length, and I hope people enjoy that content. And it's almost prophetic that technology is manifesting what a lot of mystics or scientists had basically predicted hundreds of years ago.
It's very strange. That's kind of what I'm saying earlier about what, just trying to figure out what this means. It's kind of like we have to be able to define, like you said, about solutions. And right now, hypermodernity is sort of it's at a stage of just articulating where we are. So it's kind of an ontological and even a topographical. It's in its ontological and topographical stage of questioning. And when I say where we are, well, what does it mean that we have this 2-hour whatever conversation in this hyperspace with signals that are going at the speed of light? We're in a different reality now, and before we can have solutions, we need to be able to understand, articulate it, and amplify the metaphors. And in 100 years, let's just say there isn't some catastrophe, and some of this is we find some more sustainable energy sources. Well, we're going to be living in the cloud. It's going to be like that movie Ready Player One. And I'm pretty sure something like that's going to happen, where we're going to be, the internet is something that you're going to, we're already inside of it. Psychologically, we're inside of it already, but it's going to be even more sensory, in a more immersive and sensory way. We're going to be inside of it. So it's a new reality, and we have to get a handle on it, and not be too reactionary. Whatever your opinions are on technology or on globalization, although there's problems with all of that stuff. All of that stuff is destructive and is de-worlding and all that kind of stuff. But we really don't know what any of this means. So we're at hypermodernity. It means that one dimension of this is now in the rear view, so we can designate this epoch that has come in since 1995. But we've barely scratched the surface. It's the tip of an iceberg that we've just realize that we're on, and we don't know how deep it goes. We don't have no idea what's in store for us, as this civilization comes to it's apotheosis, which I think is through this internet thing for some reason.
Right. So this first book is just, it's an investigation into the contemporary situation that we find ourselves in. And so we're just interested in raising these questions. All right.
People are curious, if you don't mind, your certificates in the background, if you wanted to share what some of those are.
Oh yeah, it's just I'm a licensed psychotherapist, so I have my license on there. Also, I have a master's degree from Pacifica Graduate Institute. That's where I studied Jungian and depth psychology. Also, I have certifications. I teach Ericksonian hypnosis, and so there's some stuff. This is my office that I'm talking to you guys in. So it's just stuff like that.
Brundlefly is an accountant, obviously, and he goes by a name because unfortunately he's got a lot of questions about demographic change and racial type things that makes it not a good idea for him to use his legal name. But yeah, he had a business emergency and wasn't able to stream. So I'm glad you two were able to join on my channel. And
yeah, thank you, and thank him for us for having us on. It's been a real pleasure, this conversation.
Yeah, I'm sure he'd be happy to have you two back also in the future.
Yeah, thank you, David. Okay.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, very cool, man. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah, and likewise. All
okay,
right.
so thanks for tuning in, everybody. I have some of the contact information for these gentlemen in the description. When I go back later after the stream, I'll add more of the links to where to purchase their books or their blogs or YouTube pages, and encourage people who are interested in these ideas to check out Michael and John's works. And I hope you guys have the time and energy to cooperate and forward these ideas.
Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.